11 students took a intensive course over the winter with Dean Ashley, and we participated in a workshop. We read a couple books, saw some videos, and part of the requirement of the course, as suggested by Dean Ashley, is to put a presentation together. May I have the 11 students that participate, well 10 because I'm number 11, stand up so that the group could see who you are? Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Demita Grant, actually 9. Demita Grant could not be here this evening. We welcome you to the presentation. This presentation is not to indict anyone. Information will be shared with you based on what we observed, learned in the workshop, what we've read, and we are just sharing information. We hope that it will be informative. We want you to, we would encourage you to seriously think about, cogitate what is said today, and also look at ways that we collectively can combat this insidious disease, and I'm going to use that term, of racism, because it has a very negative impact on our society at large. Everyone in this country is impacted, and I might add adversely, by racism. So we each have a responsibility to stand up when we see it, when we hear it, because we know what it is, and speak out against it. And as a group of believers, we're standing on faith that we collectively can make a difference. Amen? Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. And now we will have a prayer by Miss Jackie Jackson. There's another mic. Oh, this, yeah, right. Thank you.
I'm just going to move over. The light is in my eyes here. Good evening, everyone. If you can please stand and grab your neighbor's hand and let us bow our head in prayer. Thank you. Let us bow our heads. God of justice, we are your children of all colors, and we have been hurt by the evil forces of racism. Help us, God, to heal together. Help us to undo racism and to be the salt and light of the earth. Enable us, God, to see the reality of racism and free us to challenge and uproot it from our society, our world, and ourselves. Let us be open to your grace and be the balm in Gilead, so that our hearts are converted and we can join hands in unity and do your constructive work of love and justice. For all these things I thank you, and I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Next. Good evening. Is this working?
Yep, it's working.
Okay. We're here this evening to talk about our January term course, Undoing Racism. You know, a question might be asked, why this course? We can look around and see a lot of people of color in prominent positions, but is there a lot of power in these positions? In politics, the president is black, but he contends with a majority white Congress, which is influenced by corporations which have majority white managements and majority white boards of directors. In sports, there are plenty of athletes of color, but the owners and commissioners are majority white. Even in academia, there is Professor Henry Louis Gates and our own Dean Will Ashley, but again, the boards of directors and presidents of academic institutions are majority white. There seems to be a pattern here. So we attended a 2.5-day workshop presented by facilitators from the People's Institute. They helped us to understand just how entrenched racism is in our systems and culture. When you think about it, skin color is just an attribute. It really should be treated like eye color and hair color, not make a difference. But during colonization, whites made laws and treaties that resulted in skin color mattering and resulted in segregation of races. The land and resources were for white people. White people used themselves as the model for humanity, which legitimized white power and white skin privilege. What was eye-opening for me is just how ingrained white privilege is, and I'll give you a very simple example. When I get pulled over by a policeman, I know he's pulling me over for speeding and is not targeting me for discrimination or targeting me to harass me. And I do not say yes sir, no sir, because I fear being hauled down to the station if I don't. I say yes sir, no sir in the hopes that I will be shown mercy and not get a ticket. But I'm guessing that not everyone in this room has the same expectation when pulled over by the police. Don't get me wrong, racism includes individual prejudice, but it is the entrenchment in our systems that is insidious. This is what the workshop opened our eyes to. So tonight we're here to share some of our learnings and dispel 4 myths surrounding racism. 1, I'm not a racist. 2, it's an individual problem. 3, I'm not part of the problem. And 4, racism does not affect me. So one of the facilitators told us that the hardest 17 inches to travel is between our heads and our hearts. We hope that you will take that journey with us tonight.
Good evening. My name is Dan. I'm getting us started with our first myth. But before we start doing that, we want to offer a definition of racism. As this became very important during our workshop, we saw the importance, or I should say learned the importance of having a proper definition. And everything else that we'll be saying tonight stems out of this. So racism is defined as race prejudice plus the power of systems and institutions. In our conversations with each other, we tend to focus on race prejudice, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But as you will see tonight, especially in the next 3 presenters, you'll hear a lot more about why it's so important to consider this systemic aspect of racism. And we toyed around with a few different definitions of what a racist is, and there's a couple different ways you can approach this. We settled on this one, though. A racist is a member of a racially defined societal group who participates in a social system in which the dominance of that group is reinforced with systemic power. And we'll certainly unpack that one as we go through. The first myth that we want, the first idea that we want to talk about is this idea that I'm not a racist. That is definitely, absolutely a myth. And I can speak from experience growing up in rural, small-town New York, that I'm not a racist, 4 words that I've heard frequently from people. We're going to go to the next slide. We have a sampling of different excuses that people have offered to get themselves off the hook for why I'm not a racist. And I've heard all of these before. I'm sure you have. For instance, I'm not a racist. I have black friends. I socialize with all kinds of people. I have no racial preferences when hiring. I'm colorblind. I didn't enslave anybody. My jokes aren't racist. My black friends think they're funny. And on that one, I have had a handful of friends, I've heard them say that. I just, it's quite intense. And I was born privileged. It's not my fault. Very interesting. I was born this way as a defense against being accused of racism. I do have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and it's kind of, it's irresistible. You know, I could have a field day with dismantling arguments, say that one's a straw man, that was a non sequitur, whatever. But the point is, people say these things because, you know, when you're accused, when you hear that racism is something which afflicts everybody, that all white people are complicit in this problem, it's natural to feel defensive. And so you think about, I haven't enslaved anybody. I wasn't part of that program. I didn't sign on to that. I would not have agreed with that, because there's a discomfort, because it sounds like your own personal character is being attacked. There is the racial prejudice part of this that I want to talk about a little bit. I skipped ahead a little. And just some points, some things to reflect on. If you haven't reflected on this before, sometimes, well, I can testify from people that I know from my own experience that when you first start to think about this, what does it mean to be a racist? There are certain questions that can kind of help you start to see what this might be about. And these kind of more focus on the prejudicial parts of it. But for instance, when somebody says, I'm not racist, I have black friends, a good question to think about would be, are these friends among your inner circle? Would they be comfortable talking to you about race? Is there that kind of space in your friendship with them that you can touch that issue? Do you assess a person's value based on racial stereotypes? Something as simple as, we had so many stereotypes that we talked about in the workshop, but, if you hire the Asian guy, you assume he'll be good with computers, those sorts of stereotypes. Do you assess people's value based on those? Does workplace diversity really matter to you? Do you notice a room that is predominantly white? That's an interesting one. I'm from out of my own experience. When your perspective changes, when you start noticing things like that, it's mind-blowing. And the fact that, that I went so long without even thinking about those questions. Another one, do your children interact with children of color or disabled children? And we recognize that race is just one issue among many in which these power dynamics are at play, in which people are excluded and as part of the systemic problems. Do you assume that everyone has access to the same things that you have access to? And the last one I think might be my favorite. Do you ever begin a sentence by saying, I'm not racist, but my beloved mother, I love her to death. When my brother and I were growing up, we weren't exactly exposed to, deep thoughts on racial dynamics, but we did learn that whenever my mom said, I'm not racist, but we started to wince. Because the next thing that the person's going to say is just unbelievably racist. But we did talk about these are parts of the prejudicial issue. But we want to focus on the systemic part of it too. And one of the instructors in our group, Joseph Barn, who wrote this book, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church, which we all just love. You can pretty much open a page at random and something will blow your mind. But there's this great quote in here. He says, if we are going to understand racism in the church or anywhere else, the first thing we need to do is get over the popular but false assumption that personal prejudices and bigotry are what racism is all about. If we confuse prejudice with racism, not only will we misunderstand the disease, as Edwin called it, we will also be confused about the cure for the disease. We will end up believing that the solution to racism is eliminating our personal prejudices and building personal interracial relationships. As bad and as hurtful as individual race prejudice can be, and as important as it is for us to get along with each other, this is not the fundamental issue underlying racism. The fundamental issue is power. So we want to go beyond mere prejudice, especially when dealing with the myth that I'm not a racist. And this first point I want to bring up, you'll notice that if our definition of racism is correct, that makes every white person in America a racist. That's, again, it's an intense thing to say. It's certainly going to put many people's defenses up. But again, the point is not that we are attacking every single person's character, that there are, in fact, many white persons who are struggling to overcome their internalized racial prejudice. But that alone does not solve the problem of racism. To reread the definition, that a racist is a member of a racially defined societal group who participates in a social system in which the dominance of that group is reinforced with systemic power. And we don't get a say in our participation. That is the system that we live in. So a real important part of coming to grips with this, I think, is going back and kind of re-educating ourselves about American history. There's this great book. I'm sure there are plenty of great books. Talk to Dr. Ashley. This one that I really love, it's called Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen. And he does this kind of survey of all these American history high school textbooks. And just all the things that are kind of screened out of those textbooks. And one thing he says right away, he talks about Woodrow Wilson, who many of these textbooks go to such great pains to portray unambiguously as a hero, an American hero. And as it turns out, Woodrow Wilson was an outspoken white supremacist and used his presidential authority to segregate the federal government. We didn't learn that in high school because that kind of puts a downer on, learning about. We don't want our history to have those things in it. We don't want to have to deal with the fact that, our country is actually built on principles of white supremacy. But this is why we need to make a conscious decision to go back and study our history. And when we do, the reality of racism is very evident and impossible to ignore. The next point is we are not truly blind to race. When somebody says, I'm colorblind, but actually we've been trained to become blind to racism. We don't see it because we don't know what it is. We don't think about it, at least not properly. The next point. White people in America have access to a system that privileges them, and this is important because even a white person who comes to America as an adult and enters our society with absolutely no idea of what's been going on here, I guess, becomes part of that system and immediately has access to those privileges. The idea that they didn't enslave anybody, as philosophers would say, is a straw man. That's not the point. That's not what makes you a racist. And finally, if it is our default to honor the values and ideas with which we were raised, what does that mean for somebody who grew up in a racist society? I can tell you from my own experience that part of what that means is, hi, my name is Dan, I'm a recovering racist.
Good evening. The second myth, I'm going to share this one with Tammy, so I'll be brief. The second myth we come across is that the idea that racism is an individual problem. It's a myth. There, I didn't rehearse the crashing. In her book titled, there's a book titled White Privilege. That's on the next slide. There's a quote about the author's experience of racism growing up and her understanding of racism. It says, I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. So this understanding of racism, it's very common in our culture today, still. And we alluded to this before, and it's a big hindrance in us being able to identify racism and dealing with it. It's not about individual actions. That's just part of the problem. So now we're just going to frame this in different levels. These systems are much larger than our own individual actions. And Dr. Jones, on the next slide, she conducts research on social determinants of health and equity for the CDC. She describes 3 levels of racism, and we're going to use that as a framework. The first level is institutionalized racism. This is where different access to goods is available. Services, opportunities are all dictated by race. They're separated, like we said, the access to these privileges. And this creates an association between socioeconomic status and race. It's just an artificial association. So this is very possibly the most destructive aspect of racism. It's when institutions use their power to propagate this association, that the socioeconomic status and race are related to each other. The problem is those who are oppressed by these institutions, they're very often stuck because they don't have a say in what those institutions are doing. They don't get to make the big decisions, so they're stuck and they continue being oppressed. They don't get to speak out. So that's the first level, institutionalized racism. The second level is personally mediated racism, and this is the one we said, the default that we think, which is just prejudice and discrimination. This is what most people think when they hear racism. Before taking this class, that's essentially the definition I had in my head, and I think a lot of my classmates shared that too. But it's important to keep in mind that this is just one of the levels. There's a bigger picture. It's an important one. I mean, it is the method through which, racism is lived out day to day. But there's a much larger system, and we can't overlook that, the power of that system. So we've seen institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism, and the third level is internalized racism. And this is the acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. So this involves accepting limitations of one's full humanity. And the key thing here is this works both ways. It's not just the oppressed. It's present in our society, and this internalization, it begins from our childhood, growing up. Those who are part of the privileged group develop this unfounded sense of entitlement and superiority. Those who are part of the oppressed group understand themselves as limited. An individual who is part of the oppressed group grows up understanding him or herself as worth less than others. In both cases, these understandings are internalized, and they're not always conscious. And in both cases, one's development of full humanity is limited. In one case, one's ability to be oneself, to use talents and abilities, is suppressed and is limited. In the other case, the other's ability to understand the oppression of the other and to be human about it is limited. So these are the three levels of racism as described by Dr. Jones. They give us this framework in which to situate ourselves and to seek to understand this. And Tammy will unpack this a bit more.
Good evening, everyone. Okay. A lot of times when we hear racism, we usually think about black and white. We think to parallel the two to see if racism is really existing, if black people can do the same thing as white people, if we have the same access. But when you add privilege to this, racism and privilege go hand in hand, but privilege has a way of extending racism beyond the color line. In our book that we read, Privilege, Power, and Difference by Alan Johnson, he really described how privilege works in society and how it extends beyond the race. Because again, privilege is favor that is given to social categories. So those social categories include gender, it includes race, it includes socioeconomic status, it includes sexual preference, it also includes being abled or disabled. So when you start talking about privilege, you're also talking about people who are outside of a particular color. One of the ways that people lose privilege is if they are a part of a social category that is not favored. So a person's privilege can diminish based on other social categories. When you have, say for instance, a black lawyer, somebody would add black to their title, or a black doctor, as if adding black diminishes that person's credibility as a professional. So you have these things going on with privilege that disguises racism that people don't really see all the time. What matters is what people think about you and what they think the category that you belong to. So in understanding that, we have a broader view of how racism is not just an individual thing, it's a group thing where people are looking at these categories to which you belong. And if you don't belong to a certain one, then you become diminished in society. Okay, individualistic thinking keeps us in bondage, and by that, we have to understand that people make systems work, and that you have people in positions of authority, management, who are making decisions for people from a framework of thinking of individualism. So what ends up happening is that we get this skewed kind of programs or policy development that takes for granted people's resources and ability. I like this quote by Bell Hooks. She is a feminist, and she says, being oppressed means the absence of choices. So when we begin to say, why can't this person get themselves together? I mean, I did it. I went to school. I worked hard. I was able to make a difference in my life. Why can't they do it? The thing is, they don't have the choices that you had. The thing is, they don't have the resources that you have. So when you're designing a policy saying that a person needs to do X, Y, and Z, and it goes into this area that has been oppressed, and they can't measure up, then what's wrong? We're inclined to blame the person and not the system, instead of looking at how we can make these things work. And the way in which we try to get over that, people need to understand that they are working from a mind frame of privilege, and that they do have a mind frame of individualism, and that they need to not trust that they have the whole view of everything when they're making these kind of policy and program decisions. They have to be able to be in touch with the frontline people who are out there, who see what the resources are and what the people are capable of doing. And that way they can have a more sober policy and program development when it comes to helping others who are outside of yourself. We set ourselves up as good people with good intentions. We want people to see us as individuals, not as members of a social category, but we do want people to treat us as members of social categories when it works for our advantage. So we have to be able to put aside our privilege, know that we do have privilege. Even as an African-American woman with a college degree, I have some level of privilege. But there are also some liabilities that I have as being a woman and being African-American that people may not favor. So again, and taking that into consideration and considering that others are out there who may also have liabilities because they belong to a less favored category, we have to be mindful that we reach all people in all that we do in ministry and management, as well as teaching and education. Thank you.
Thus far, we've seen I am not a racist, it's an individual problem. The third myth, I'm not part of the problem. Racism, privilege, and oppression exist only through social systems and people's participation in them. Historically, systems were built to benefit white people. Race privilege happens through systems that are white-dominated, white-identified, and white-centered. All three characteristics of race privilege supports the perpetuation of internalized racial superiority among the privileged group. We go along to get along. We, all of us in this room, at one time or another, have accepted a path of least resistance. What does that mean, to accept a path of least resistance? What it means is you'll hear a racial joke. And because you want to be part of the in crowd, you laugh as well when you know that the joke is offensive. You see something on your job that is inequitable. Why does the Puerto Ricans always have to sit at the front desk? Why are the blacks always getting written up for coming back 5 minutes late when you'll have a white manager who takes a 2 or 3 hour lunch and nothing is ever said? You're asked about it and you say, oh well, I'm not in that. That's above my pay grade. Social injustice is not above anyone's pay grade. Internalized racism. People that are oppressed accept less than what is accepted by the superior, by an internalized racial superior or privileged group. And why do we do that? We do it because after many years of being indoctrinated with a feeling of less worth, we start to devalue our own selves. And to me, this is critical because what I have seen in society is that the impacts of internalized racial inferiority is that we pass that on to our children. We become dependent upon a system of welfare. We become dependent upon not wanting to emphasize the importance of education, making sure that our children have dreams, have hopes, continue to inspire and be inspired by others, role models. We kind of like put ourselves, our own generations, our children, our grandchildren, and we just kind of like block them. We stop them. And it's because we have begun to look at ourselves in society as not being as worthy. I'm going to turn this over to Ed, and he is going to go over, and I want you to really pay attention to this part of the program because I think all of us in this room, it's key. We will see dominance, centered identification, and the centered focus, and the third characteristic, identity. We will see and we will walk away from this part of the presentation with a memory of how in some way we have all participated in these characteristics of that's organized around privilege.
Talk about putting pressure on. Oh my. Thank you, Deborah. Dominance. Positions of power are dominated by the privileged group. And as noted earlier, whites are the dominant group. And particularly white, heterosexual, middle and upper middle class, suburban type males. And I'm going to read something for you that's taken from the book that has been referenced, Privilege, Power, and Difference by Alan Johnson. The oppressive effect of privilege is often so insidious that dominant groups complain whenever it's brought up for discussion. They feel impatient and imposed on. Come on, they say, stop whining. Things aren't that bad. Maybe they used to be, but not anymore. It's time to move on. Get over it. But people who are white or heterosexual or male or non-disabled or middle or upper class have to ask themselves how they would know how bad it really is to be a person of color or a lesbian or a woman or gay or disabled or working or lower class. Power is identified with members of the privileged group. In the 2.5 days workshop that we had, when the facilitators asked whites in the class do they think about being white? And there were questions about, do you think about being, black? And most of the white people said, no, it's just a natural thing. They just get up and they're white. And it was noted earlier, I think by Sue, when she mentioned, driving down the highway, she doesn't have to worry about driving while being black, for example. I have a 25-year-old son who is here today. I know I'm sorry, son, I have to put you on the spot. And Jonathan, he's a graduate of Rutgers. He brought the condiments, and we appreciate you, son. But, just driving down the highway, he's experienced racism. In fact, in my neighborhood, he was walking down the block from a friend's house, and a police officer drove along beside him and asked him, what are you doing in the neighborhood? And he said, well, I live 4 houses down, officer. How can I help you, sir? And the police officer said, well, there have been some robberies in the neighborhood. And my son said, well, thank you for sharing. I'm not aware of any robberies. And so he proceeded to walk. Well, the normal occurrence would be that the police officer would drive off, correct? No, he followed him until he punched the code in. Thank God you remember the code. To get into the house, I guess he had to demonstrate and show the police officer that he was legit. And so people with power and privilege, they take things for granted. People of color, disabled, gay, lesbian women, it's a different story for those of us that fall in that category. People on the outside of privilege feel invisible when looking upward in all kinds of power structures and not seeing people who look like them. There is this notion that people in business tend to do business with people that they feel most comfortable with. Let me repeat that. People in business tend to do business with people that they feel most comfortable with. So to a large extent, that will exclude women, gay, lesbian, those who are disabled, and people of color. And, we talked about the president. There is this thought that because he is president that, well, things are great. Well, no, it isn't. In the corporate setting, as we talked about, people who run have access to power and privilege. They tend not to look like me in as much as we strive to get there, or some of you. And so that has to change, and it will change in time. Now, we've made progress, but we have work to do. People on the outside of privilege don't see their interest represented when power is wielded and rewards are distributed. We see this in the church. We see that people are not rewarded for doing the hard work, for getting the pedigrees, and doing everything that is required to get to the next level. There is that glass ceiling that still exists in churches, in the corporate settings, in schools, in all facets of these United States. People on the outside of privilege are not encouraged to imagine themselves as one of those with access to power and rewards. People who don't have power and privilege find it difficult to make the change. They don't write the scripts. They don't call the shots. And if you're not writing the scripts, for example, for a show, the depiction of that person in the show will oftentimes, for people of color, those that are gay, lesbians, etc., will not be a positive depiction. It will have a very negative depiction of that person. You know what I'm talking about. You see African Americans on television. A lot of times, how are they depicted? You see people, Hispanic people, people of Asian background, women, how are they depicted? It's oftentimes not in a positive light, again, because more often than not, they're not writing the script. So unless you're writing the script, you're not in a position to dictate how you're portrayed. Moving on to identity. Privileged groups are identified as a standard of comparison that represents the best. White males, blonde, blue eyes. You know, you look at television, you see the commercial. I remember as a kid watching a commercial, I'd ask my mom, you know, why is this person always, why is the television, the commercial always, you know, a person of this persuasion? Well, because that's the way it is. Now, again, we're not writing the scripts, and so the identity piece is a big piece. America is culturally identified as white in spite of the diversity of the population. When we see people of color, people who are disabled, women, we tend not to see them, again, in the way that they should be portrayed, because people of color, women, disabled individuals, all bring positive attributes to the table. And in fact, we're doing ourselves as a nation a disservice by not being more inclusive and valuing the cultural differences that people bring to the table. Most workplaces define appropriate appearance of ways of speaking in terms that are culturally associated with white, from clothing and hairstyle to diction and slang. The reality is, if you do not conform, you will be put out. And so it requires extra effort sometimes to assimilate, to blend in, to speak the king's language. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you say something in passing and it doesn't fit that appropriate diction, automatically it's stored in someone's mind as, oh boy, I'm not sure that he'll be able to represent us well. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was in Cleveland, Ohio. I had to give a presentation from my supervisor. I had to beg to give the presentation, but that's another story. And I was the last person between the meal and the dessert, and it was late. And so I knew that I stood in the way of them going out and having a good time, and I wasn't as religious as I am now, so I too wanted to have a good time. And so when I gave my presentation talking about the FDIC and what we do, we're the savior of the banking industry, etc., I got done, and I was walking towards the back, and a gentleman said to me, Mr. Lloyd, I appreciate your presentation, and you speak so well. And I looked, he had introduced himself, and let's say his name is Brown, and this isn't to offend any Brown in here. I said, Mr. Brown, and so do you, thank you. I wasn't sure what Mr. Brown meant by that, but I'm thinking, are you serious? You know, I am a professional, you're a professional. I was sent here by the FDIC to make a presentation, so that comment wasn't necessary. What he said was, I enjoyed your presentation, thank you for coming out. That should have sufficed. People on the outside of privilege assimilate. I mentioned that. We have no choice. If we don't assimilate, we'll be out the gate. It's very important that we do what's necessary so that we could have jobs, we could get into schools, we could feed our families, we could do all the things that we want to do as Americans. People on the outside of privilege feel pressure to talk, dress, and act like middle-class whites in order to fit in and accept it. And that's a truism, and that's so unfortunate, because we should not, or people should not have to give up who they are to be a part of the culture, because this is a melting pot. If you don't have a certain hairstyle, if you dress a certain way as noted in the earlier slide, you do not fit in, and so therefore you are targeted and oftentimes are overlooked for promotional opportunities or overlooked for getting the rewards and the recognition, because if you don't have the opportunities to do the work, you certainly will not have, you will not be in a position to clearly articulate at the end of your day, you know, your performance evaluation. I think you all get that, right? You demonstrate what you've done. Well, if you don't have the opportunity to do that, then you're not going to get it. So in order to be a part of the system, you have to conform. You have to act a certain way. And the third characteristics, centered focus. Most of what is written or reported in the media is centered focus on the dominant group. Again, we do not write the scripts, and unless we write the scripts about how we should be projected and portrayed, racism will continue to be the way it is, and it will continue to be damaging to all of us. National heroes, success stories, and national figures written about and held up for general admiration have been centered focus on dominant group members. We have a lot of talent in all aspects of, all through the country. We have people that are disabled that have talents. We have people of color that have talent, women, lesbian, gays, but the standard bearer, the person that fits the mold, again, goes back to what Mr. Johnson noted: white, heterosexual male, middle class, upper middle class, not disabled, not gay. The production of most products and services are centered focus on dominant group. It goes back to what I said earlier about what we see on television, who's portrayed and how they're portrayed. And oftentimes the folks that I mentioned that falls in that category are not portrayed in the light, in a positive light. And the impact of that, center focus on dominant groups make people on the outside of privilege feel invisible. Well, if you don't have power and you don't have privilege, and folks that are superior will have the power, the privilege, and you're going to feel inferior, and you'll also feel invisible because you're not part of the decision-making process. You're not writing the script. You're not part of the board of trustees that are sitting down, that are setting policies that will have an impact on what happens here. You're not part of board of directors on a bank's board that's setting the policies, making decisions that will impact what happens in the communities in terms of lending opportunities, where loans are made, who gets what, how much they get. So unless you are in a position of power, which oftentimes, again, people do business with people that they feel most comfortable with, which exclude certain group, unless you're in that group making those decisions, well, communities will not be served. Decisions that are made will yes, I got it, will adversely impact. Internalized racism. Centered focus on dominant groups diminishes history, humanities, experience, spirituality, and personal transformation of people on the outside of privilege. Internalized racism has a deleterious impact on all of us. We're in a position to make a difference. And the impact, as noted earlier, and I've said, is so deleterious that it creates and causes health problems for us without us even recognizing it.
In the few minutes we have left, Kelvin and I are going to address the last myth, which is racism does not affect me. And we have this great quote from Joseph Barnt, his book, Becoming a Anti-Racist Church. Willingly or unwillingly, we are all a part of racism. Our nation was constructed with clearly defined racial structures whose primary purpose was to separate all people of color from white people, but which also served to separate people of color from each other by placing them into categories of Native American, African American, Latino Hispanic, Asian American, and Arab American. I think racism affects us most when we don't even know we're being affected by it. And the thing that was really most powerful to me was hearing the history of the country that I grew up in and learning about all the laws that were written specifically to support white supremacy, to categorize white as human and all other as not. And I grew up checking this box in school on those standardized tests, where you belong, and never even questioned why I was checking that box. And now that I know we're checking that box so we can separate people, it makes me more a racist because I don't even know. So that's, I think, the overarching point behind our whole presentation is understanding racism, unpacking it, and acquiring more knowledge. And then our great definition of privilege. To have privilege is to be allowed to move through your life without being marked in ways that identify you as an outsider, as exceptional or other, to be excluded or to be included, but always with conditions. Privilege is another one of those things that unless you know about it, you're just complicit in it. And again, that's another thing that really has come out to me is I didn't know what white privilege was till I came to the seminary, and I don't think I'm the only one. So I think that's part of, particularly for us here at New Brunswick Seminary, as we're training pastors and people who are going to go out in the world to grow other servants and to preach the gospel, it's important that we are aware of that here and aware of how we're complicit in it. And in order to make the steps individually, we talked about how it's an institution, and that's really important. It's very big institutionally, but there are individual things that we can each do to work against this white privilege. You know, when I know that I'm receiving something because of my whiteness and someone else isn't, it's incumbent upon me to stand up for that person who isn't receiving the same privilege. Otherwise, this cycle of racism is just going to keep continuing, and there's going to be no end to it. So it's important to understand it, and then it's important to act on it. And my friend Kelvin is going to finish up with us.
Good evening. Let me start off by reading a quote that's in the book that we have been referencing this evening by Joseph Barnt, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church. He says that analysts of racism have become aware in recent years of the effects of the intricate process of socialization through which persons internalize an identity particular to their own racial group and act out that identity like puppets on a string. Each and every person of color is racialized to be a part of a racial group that is socialized to accept the negative effects of racism and to behave accordingly, and to behave according to a racist society standard of people of color. It is an identity-making process called internalization of inferiority. And each and every white person is racialized to be part of the white race and is socialized to accept white power and privilege as a way of life and to behave according to a racist society's standards for white people. This internalization of inferiority and internalization of superiority is prominent in our systems that we are dealing with today. And you've heard a lot about how that is manifested. I just wanted to bring it just a little bit even more closer to home. Can we go to the next? When we talk about white privilege and how it continues today, whites do not have to educate their children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. Lloyd was talking about earlier how his son was pulled over by the police. As people of color, these are the things that we deal with on a daily basis. a person who does not have to deal with that, a white person, is affected in the same way by not having to do it. The playing field becomes different. If one group of people have to deal with those kinds of things and the other does not, that is a system manifesting itself. In this particular case, it is a system of law enforcement. The images of God, Jesus, angels, and other biblical figures are usually portrayed as white. When I think about God, when I think about Jesus, the way we have become racialized is that when we see God, many of us see a white person. One of the most famous images, I forget who is by, you see the picture of the image of Jesus kneeling down with his hands crossed like this and the long hair. It's a white person. When you see the image of Jesus knocking on the door, it's a white person. When you see that movie, The Passion of Christ, and how intense that it was, the person who played Jesus was a white person. So, again, it is the system, in this case, the system of organized religion that is manifesting white privilege. Whites are never asked to speak for all of the people of their racial group. I mean, I've been blessed enough to attend school at places where it was predominantly white people, and just in regular conversation with my classmates, I happened to be in high school where I was one of about maybe 10 of us in the entire school, and this was a school that had about 500 students. So the conversations would be around, well, what do your people think? What do my people think? I can't speak for all of my people. I could tell you what I think, but I cannot speak for everyone within my race. So again, it's the manifestation of white privilege that whites do not have to think about those things, where people of color have to deal with it every day. In this instance, it's the system of education. Whites can assume that when they go shopping, they will be treated as serious customers, not as potential shoplifters or people without the money to make a purchase. When we go into the stores, particularly some of these special stores and some of these boutiques, the salesperson may give you a long look, or you may be followed around the store, or you may be asked, how can I help you? Not in a sense so much to want to assist you, but in a sense like you need to move on. Again, when those things happen to people of color, where it does not happen to white people, it is all of us. This time, we're talking about the social, so-called social norms that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So it's those kind of things that we are looking at, and it's those kind of things that we want to work towards undoing. One thing that I didn't mention before, when we hear the words white racism, white privilege, people tend to get a little, can I talk about this? Folks get a little uncomfortable because it's a delicate and it's a sensitive area that folks use and kind of like shy away from. But if we are going to move forward as God's people, as God's people looking at one another without race, we have to be able to come to a point where we're able to be comfortable to share these conversations person to person, to be able to unpack it, to be able to understand it, so that we will be able to do what needs to be done to undo it. Which brings us to where we're about to close. So we ask the question, where do you see the reality of racism playing out in your life? Whose stories do you need to hear? How can you become part of the project to undo racism in your family, community, church, and country? Some of the ways that we could do it is just by starting to have those conversations with one another without being uncomfortable, without being afraid to touch the subject, to be able to dare to make other people uncomfortable when we see these patterns of racism going on all around us. Networking. One of the things that we learned in our Undoing Racism workshop was to be able to network with other people who are also working on the anti-racism, and I'm going to call it a movement, anti-racism movement within society and within the church at large. So those are some of the things that you've heard today that we present to you, that we hope and pray that you would think about, because the Word of God said, let us make humans in our own image, male and female. He made them. So he didn't say, God didn't say, let us make a white person, let us make a black person, he said, let us make human. And in God's infinite variety, he made us all. Amen? Amen. Amen.